Okay, last time we covered, I think, the server-side component of the Ajax application that we were working on that takes user input and displays all the mathematical terms that begin with the character string that we've typed in. And then, when you click on one to select it and click the button, it shows you the Spanish translation. So I think we went over the server-side component of the first portion of it. There's actually two Ajax requests here, one to get the list of words, one to get the definition for the selected word. So I think we went over the server-side piece of the first portion of it to get the list of words. And in the first pass, we're going to compare and contrast different methods of doing this. In the first pass, we set back delimited data. And by delimited data, what we mean is characters split up, special characters split up the data into pieces. Alright? And oftentimes you hear talk of comma delimited or tab delimited data. In this particular case, I used, for no good reason, I mean, I suppose I could, well, let me rephrase that. There was a reason why I used the characters that I used, and we'll talk about that reason in a second. But I used a colon to separate the index from the word, and then I used a semicolon to select or to separate the list of words. Alright? So I actually have two delimiters in here. One that separates the set of index and word, and one that separates into the single word into its two components. So let's download this. This will be much easier to see as opposed to talk about. So I'll go and extract the zip file. No. You're supposed to know this stuff. You're supposed to tell me what's up there. It's Monday. I'm grumpy. What can I say? Alright, so here is the results after we call the server-side code from the query string and pass, or from the address bar, and we pass on the query string the letter A. I think it's important to get the troubleshooting process that I'm going through in addition to understanding the way the code works. Because there's several things that you can do if it doesn't work, and there's several things you can do to test out pieces of it at a time until you bring everything together. So I think it's really important to have that down. So in this case, what I've done is I have my server-side script, and it's supposed to give me, and actually I reversed these when I said that, it's supposed to give me a list of words separated by colon, and each word consists of the word part and an index. Alright. And if we look at the code, we'll see what that looks like. We have an include file that includes two arrays that are in parallel, an English and a Spanish one. We take the query string, from the query string, the term word. We loop through the English array, and we determine if the string that was typed in by the user matches the first part of the word. That's what this if statement here says. If the starting position in the word that we're looking at matches what the user typed in, that's what equals 0 means, that's where it found that string, then we have a winner, and I can output the word, a semicolon, and the index of it. If it made it through the whole loop and it didn't get any hits, then it outputs no word matches this pattern. So any questions about this? All right, let's think of what we have to do now on the servers, or I'm sorry, on the client side. On the client side, we want to format that and output it. Remember, the server does its role, the client does its role. The server's role is to supply the data. And to supply the data without any formatting is the ideal. And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the quiz. We talked about how the quiz could output the percentage that the person had correct, the server-side component of the quiz Ajax example. But we decided that that wasn't the best thing to do, all right? Because if we give the raw data to the client can choose how to present it. So if we give, instead of a percentage correct, if we give each question right or wrong, an indication of whether it was right or wrong, then the client can compute the percentage if the percentage is something that is needed. And if not, and we want to see individual questions right and wrong, we have that data too. So again, keep in mind that the server should not be concerned with formatting the data. The server should be concerned with outputting the data in a manner that it can be parsed and that the client can format it. And when I talk about formatting here, I'm talking about formatting it on the web page. Yes, this is formatted a certain way, but it's not formatted in a way that is going to be displayed. So, let's look at the client side for this. Generally speaking, if I'm writing or debugging an Ajax application, this is a step that I do first. I look at the server-side code and make sure that when I give it something on the query string, it outputs what I expect. Then I look at the client-side code to make sure that my code is making the request in the manner that I would expect it. All right. Onkeyup method. All right. Onkeyup is a user event, and it's one that we probably haven't talked about in this class or in any of the classes here. What that actually does is that causes code to run when we finished pressing a key. All right? There's actually an on key up and an on key down. The down happens first, the up happens when you release the key. Now on key up is the one that we want here, because with on key down actually would lose a character, because as soon as we press the key, before that key actually gets typed in the text box, the on key down method fires off. So it would always be one character behind if we use the on key down. If you don't believe me, change the one word to on key down from on key up, and you'll notice if you type in A, nothing happens. If you type in AB, then you get the A's. If you type in ABC, you get the AB's, and so on down the line. All right, so on key up, we're calling get words, and we're passing this dot value. What does this mean in this statement? Yeah, the object that this code is actually on, the object that's calling the function. And in this instance, this refers to the text box. So this dot value is the value of the text box. And we're calling the getWords method. What does getWords do? Well, and make sure that there's something in there. All right? If there's nothing in there, then we're getting rid of everything that's in the dropdown. So if argentered is a space, or if argentered starts with a space, we clear out the dropdown. So to see that behavior, if I type in A, I get the list of A's. If I backspace, so nothing was there, it clears it out. And these are the statements that do that. I point to the dropdown. I say dropdown equals document, frm math, dd words. Then I say dd.options.length equals 0. What that does is that clears out all the options. What I've done here is a slightly different style of coding than I typically do. Usually I use the getElementById method. All right. Here I am using a different way to address that form element. An alternative way in the DOM, I'm saying dd equals document on the web page. frm math, that means somewhere on the math form, .dd words. Somewhere on the math form there is something with a name of dd words. Not an ID, but a name of dd words. So I try to vary up sometimes the syntax I do just to confuse you. It's funny to look at the expressions of confusions when I do this. No, I'm just kidding. I do this just in case you're referring to a resource or something. You're online and you're looking and you see an example. I like to do things a few different ways. That gives you a better chance of recognizing this if you see it again somewhere. So this is an alternate way of specifying that. I'm also doing it a little bit different in that I am grabbing and I'm pointing to the drop-down with this statement. And once I do that, then I don't have to write out this whole thing every time. I can just say dd.options. Because dd points to this. And I set the options length to 0. Alright, so that's what I do if there's no characters in there. And specifically that's for backspacing after I've entered something in. Otherwise, what do? This is pretty straightforward. HTTP open, get, dictionary1, question mark, dictionary1.php word equals, and then I plug in the argument entered after it. And I get the argument entered from the argument of this function, which, as we recall, came from the text box. If I wanted to make sure that this was correct, I could put an alert to display that. So I could go like this. Alright. If I ran it then, I could actually see the request it's making. Alright. When your code isn't working, don't be so sure that you know the reason why it isn't working, if that makes sense. It's kind of like when I lose my keys, which I do like 5 times a week anymore. Alright? I should not be so sure that I haven't left them in the laundry room. You know, I'll think to myself, well, I don't need to look in the laundry room. They're not in there. Well, guess what? If you don't know where they are, then you probably better not assume that you know where they are not, right? So if your program isn't working, don't assume, well, I know this part of it is working. The problem must be some other place in the program. How long does it take to go and put an alert in there and display the values to ensure yourself that it indeed is making the request that you expect it is? Takes you probably literally 2 minutes, if even that. Alright? And by doing that, then you can check that off your list. And you can say, okay, I know the problem isn't there. If for whatever reason it isn't working, if I check and yes, it's making the request it's supposed to, I can move on and look at something else. So that's why I go through a systematic approach. And the idea is, and this is a good lesson I learned from one of my old bosses, the idea is prove that what you think is true. You think that this part is working correctly, figure out a way to prove it to yourself. Now in Ajax, we've looked at a couple different ways to prove it to yourself. One is by running the server-side script and typing in the URL. And we can see on the screen what gets returned. That's one way we can prove to ourselves that that portion of the code is working. How do I prove that this portion of the code is working? By doing an alert. Alright? Later on, when we start parsing this, how could I prove I'm getting back what I expected to? Well, by doing another alert and by displaying the response text that comes back from the server. In addition to all these, don't forget to look at JavaScript errors. Now, depending on what browser you have, you'll find the JavaScript errors in a different place. Chrome and Firefox have some nice developer extensions that you can use to help you look through. In this particular case with Chrome, I can go under More Tools. Well, there's Developers Console, and underneath it there's a JavaScript console. I can click on that, and I can see if there's any JavaScript errors there. In this case, there isn't any, but that's okay, it's working. I wouldn't expect there to be any. The point is, and again, you know, you could accuse me of beating a dead horse, but the key is to have a systematic way to troubleshoot your code and not simply just look at your code and you know, and take shots at doing things. All right, but rather check out things in a logical fashion, in a logical sequence. When you've eliminated one as a possible cause of the problem, then go on to the next one, and so on down the line. Is that perfect? Will you always find your problem that way? Well, no, you know, there might be things that you overlook, but it gives you a much better chance than just sort of flailing at the problem. All right. this is the callback function. All right. If I make the request, this is the function that's going to get called when this finishes. HTTP, if you remember up here, is a object used to create XML HTTP requests. It's our pipeline. In this particular example, I have two pipelines. I have two objects because I'm making two different Ajax requests. I probably could get away with just using one, the way this works, but I did two. All right. In that way, I can pretty much assure myself that the one request isn't going to guarantee or isn't going to mess up the other request. So the callback method. This is asynchronous. All right. What does asynchronous mean? It means not synchronized. So when I issue this request, it's not like the answer is available right here on the very next line of code. The server has to do some work to get that answer. And we're simply specifying, server, when you get this answer, this is what method needs to get called. All this is controlled by the HTTP object. So when the server tells that object that, hey, here's your answer, the HTTP object calls that callback function, create DD. All right. So, what is the code to create the dropdown? All right. This is a method that gets called. When the method gets called, we would expect to have data in the format that we described. Which is the word, a semicolon, the index, a colon, then the next word. So how do you suppose we're going to parse this? What does parse mean? It means breaking down a big string in the parts. Well, we have a command that takes a string and splits it into an array based on a delimiter. All right. This is coming back to the client as one long string. This will be stored in the HTTP response text. So we have one big string that has all this in it. What do we need to do? We need to split it. And we need to split it twice. We're going to split it using the colon as a delimiter. So each element is going to look like this of that array. It's going to have the word, a semicolon, and the index. The next element is going to have a word, semicolon, index, and so on down the line. So that array is going to give us a list of all the words. There'll be as many elements in that array as there are words. One thing to keep in mind is we don't know how many results we're going to get from this. If we type in an A, we're probably going to get a different number of results than if we typed in an X, for example. However, if we split the string using the colon as a delimiter, then we're going to have an array where every element is going to be something that looks like this. Well, what are we going to do then? We're going to loop through that array. All right, we're first going to look at this string, then look at the next string, then look at the next string. What are we going to do? We're going to split that string using the semicolon as a delimiter, so we have our two pieces. So we have our name, or our word, and we have our index. What are we going to do with those? We're going to make an option in our dropdown. What is that option going to look like? that option is going to have as a value the index. And the text for that option is going to be the name of the word. Alright, so let's look at the code that accomplishes this. First of all, we make sure that the server is indeed done. That's what the status of 4, or the ready state of 4, corresponds to. Remember that there are several intermediary statuses that the server reports back to the client to let it know that it's making progress on this. Now this is something that's hard to demonstrate in an environment like this because these requests happen very quickly, but if the server was doing a lot of work, like accessing a database and doing a lot of work to do that, we might want to display some message at each status saying, all right, it's making progress, it's making progress, it's making progress, boom, here's your answer. I set the variable to HTTP response text. What is response text? Response text is going to be this whole string of what we're getting back from the server. Response text is one of two places that the client can find the response from the server, depending on the kind of response. If it's delimited text or if it's JSON, then response text on the HTTP object is going to have the response from the server. If the answer came back from the server in the form of XML, then it's going to be response XML. So there's two places the response can go, depending on whether it's plain text or HTML. In this case, it's just delimited text, plain text. It's not XML, therefore the response is in HTTP response text. I create a variable for the new option I'm going to make. All right. I point to the dropdown. I clear out the dropdown, like I did before, and then I split into an array called A-English, the response text using the colon. So when I'm done, there'll be one row in that array per word that the server responded with. And each element of the array is going to be the word, a semicolon, and then the index. Next element is going to be the word, semicolon, the index, and so on down the line. All right, almost there. We loop through. We start with I equals 0. We do this as long as I is less than the length of that array. So we're doing it for each item in that A-English array. And we're looking at every individual item. We're incrementing I by 1 each time. We then take that word and split it using the semicolon. So the first time through the loop, this is what's going to be in A-English sub I. This is what's going to be in it the second time, third time, and so on. For as many elements as there are. That's why our loop goes for as many elements are in that array. So we're going to split that string using the semicolon. And we're going to store that result in another array. So, after we're done splitting this, we're going to have a second array called A option. One first element, sub 0, is going to contain the word. The second element is going to contain the index. So what do I do? dd.options. All right, let's break down this statement. What does dd.options refer to? First, my dropdown, right? Because dd equals my dropdown. The options are an attribute of a dropdown. All right? We probably haven't seen this in class before because we've never dynamically created a dropdown before. We've gotten the values from a dropdown, but we've never gone and dynamically created a dropdown. So, just like a text box has a value and a radio button has a checked property, a dropdown has an options list. All right, and this is an array, it's a list, because a dropdown, of course, can have multiple options. So I'm setting one of its options. I'm using the length, the current length of that dropdown, as the place where to put this option. Well, the first time through the loop, we've cleared out that length, the 0. So the first time through the loop, the first word is going to get created as option 0 for this dropdown. Second time through the loop, option 1. Third time, option 2, and so on. This is just a convenient way to keep saying, hey, add on to the end of the option list a new option. Because every time through the loop, this option length gets greater by 1 each time through the loop. Initially it's 0. First time through is going to, after the first time through is going to be 1, and so on. So we're going to be adding an option at the end of the list of options for this dropdown. And what does that equal to? It equals to new option, option 0, A option sub 0, A option sub 1. What is that? Well, that's the array that we split. A option 0 corresponds to the word. A option 1 corresponds to the value. So when we do that, we get a dropdown where the text of the dropdown is the name and the value for the dropdown is the index. Now, DDOptions, options, and new option. Is that stuff I made up? No. It's part of the DOM. It's just a part of the DOM that we haven't used before. So be aware that there's ways to point to almost everything on the web page. And we haven't covered all of them. But just know that if it's on the web page, there's a way to refer to it using the DOM. And there's a way to create it. We could, for example, dynamically create images in a similar way if we wanted to do that. If I do a quick Google search here, and pick JavaScript DOM option, I can see exactly how I can create that. Actually show me an alternative way to create it. So this is, again, something that we haven't done so far. And one of the reasons that I did it is to sort of show you that if it's on the web page, there's more than likely a way to refer to it via the DOM. All right? Because that's what the DOM means, Document Object Model. So there's a way to point to any aspect of the page. And part of being successful in researching and finding the answer to, gee, how would I create an option, is to sort of have faith that, yeah, I know that everything on the page is represented by an object. It's just a matter I have to find out what that object is and find out what the methods are for that object. In this case, if I say new option, I can create a new option with the word as the visible part of it and the value behind the scenes. Any questions about this? What would I do if I were troubleshooting this? Well, I would, again, put alerts in. First and foremost, I'd put an alert in to make sure that this response text was the value that I expected it to be. Right? I'm expecting that response text to contain a list of words, each one separated by a colon. So if I put an alert in there, that's what I should see. Again, not a case of just thinking that's probably what it's going to be, but proving to yourself, yeah, that's what I expect and that's what I'm getting. I could also put in alerts after the splitting to see what's in that A options array or what's in the A English array and so on. Any questions about this? Yes, the question makes sense. It is a count of how many words got returned. All right. Strictly speaking, we're splitting this big string up using the colon. So everything that gets split by colon, that's an element in A English. So this would be A English sub 0. This would be A English sub 1. And the count of that is simply how many of these we get. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and we're going to take each element in A English in turn, and we're going to split it again using the semicolon to break it down into the name and the value. Other questions? So at this point, what we have is this. We have a drop down that is formatted where the word is being displayed in the drop down, but behind the scenes, stored as the value of the drop down, is the index of that term in the array. Unfortunately, because the way this is generated, I can't do a view source and show you what that drop-down looks like. Right? Because when that code got delivered to the client, there was nothing in the drop-down, so it's going to look like it's an empty drop-down. Now what happens when I click Go? If I pick something and click Go. All right. Well, if you remember, there's these arrays. The value of the dropdown is going to be the position of the term in the array. This being element 0, this being element 0, this being element 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So if I started off and I typed in B here, basic, whatever that subscript for basic is, looks like it would be like 28. That's the value of that dropdown. And that's what's going to get passed back to the client, and that's what's going to get formatted as the value of this dropdown. So, what happens when I go and select an item and click go? Alright, I make another Ajax request, right? Because my initial request did not return the Spanish translation. My initial request returned the index and the English version of this. So what I need to do is I need to ask the server again, hey, what's the Spanish translation for this? And this is going to be super straightforward, right? This is like shooting fish in a barrel, all right? Because I already have the array element that I'm interested in. The server side is simply going to return that element in the Spanish array. Piece of cake. So let's look at the server side code for dictionary 2. I include the array. I grab the index from the query string, and I return the Spanish definition that corresponds, or the Spanish translation that corresponds to that English term. So in other words, this one, the request the server is going to get looks like this. Dictionary2.php, question mark, index equals 5, for example. And that's all the server does, is it grabs the element out of that array and returns it. Piece of cake. All right. In fact, when we go over the other methods of doing this, we're not going to go over this part again. Because when we use JSON and when we use XML, the first part of this example changes, but this part stays the same. Because this part, we're only returning a single Spanish translated word. All right? So we're always just going to use plain old simple data to send this back. Let's look at the client then. When I click the button, I call GetTranslation. GetTranslation does what? Well, it grabs the selected index from the dropdown. Actually, it grabs the value of the selected index. This is another way to refer to the value of the drop. Document frm math dd words selected index dot value. If I equals -1, then I say select a valid word. What is that for? That's for the case of when nothing matches. So I typed in some garbage here. The value that I made for that is -1. So it displays set a, or select a valid word. We can see, how did that happen? Well, we output no words match this pattern in the event that it made it through the whole loop of the array and didn't find any matches. So I make the request. I use a different object because this is a different request. I probably could use the same object, but I wouldn't want things interfering with each other. On ready state change, I call DisplayTranslation. So when I have my final answer, I'm going to call DisplayTranslation. And in this case, it's super easy. If I have a ready state of 4, I go and I output into that results div the response text. I don't have to do any parsing, right? Because what comes back from the server for this request is simply the Spanish translated term. I don't have a list of things. I just have the one thing. So I don't need to break up that response text into its pieces. Questions about this? All right, next time we're going to look at JSON and Ajax. JSON and XML as a way of transferring data. Now, if you think about it, as I mentioned before, there's really no reason to redo this second part. The second part is simply returning one answer. It would be overkill to return that as a JSON object or as an XML object. One could, however, make the argument for returning the list of words as a JSON object or an XML object. So that'll be the part of this example that we're going to look at changing. Because the other part, it doesn't really make any sense to change it. It's simple, yeah, but it gets the job done. There's really no reason to muddy the waters by changing that. All right, any questions? All right, we'll see you in lab.